Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. My guest is Laurence Boone, the Secretary of State for European Affairs in the French government. Instead of climbing up the greasy pole of politics, Laurence Boone pursued a career in economics, during which she advised various prestigious financial institutions and also became chief economist at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. She took up her current job in July 2022, soon after President Emmanuel Macron was elected to a second term in office. She has a lot of items in her in tray, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we can in this segment. So welcome to you, Laurence Boone. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with the situation in Ukraine and this growing realization in the West that NATO stocks are becoming depleted. Meanwhile, Russian industrial production is actually going up. I know you're not the defense minister, but what are your thoughts on this?
What the European Union is doing, by the way, in coordination with NATO, is to support and increase, wherever necessary, the weapons that Ukraine needs. And it does this based on three criteria: that they can be utilized immediately, which is not always the case, as you know, that it is helpful at this very moment to Ukraine against Russia, so that it makes a difference in the war. And the third thing is that it doesn't weaken our capabilities as well to defend ourselves, which I think is important, and it doesn't lead to any escalate. And based on all these criteria, I think Europe, again, in coordination with the US and other NATO countries, have managed to support Ukraine in such a way that where Russia thought that it would invade Ukraine in a few days or a few weeks, it's now going to be a year. So Ukraine has very well resisted this Russian invasion.
Having said that, the sanctions that the EU has slapped on Russia, they don't affect this artillery production, which is kind of the key thing, isn't it, in these battles of attrition in Bakhmut and places like that?
Oh, they do, because we have sanctions on people who are obviously behind this. We have sanctions which are economics as well, banning all the goods which can be used both for civil and military purposes, so electronics, chips getting into drones, materials needed to do that. You don't have a plane in Russia that can now be maintained or repaired with any Western material. And that means that most of them have to stay on the ground.
Yeah, I was talking more about artillery, but I take your point. Where do things stand on the 10th package of sanctions? From your information, is this actually likely to be in place by the 24th of February?
You will have a Council of Foreign Affairs Ministers where, as you know, the French Minister, Catherine Colonna, will be going. And then you will hear about the details of this. But yeah, we are pursuing and deepening sanctions against people, to weaken the industry, to weaken the economy, and to weaken their military capacity. I think the objective at the end of the day is that Russia can never do such a thing again, ever.
In regards to Moldova, what are your thoughts on the developments there, these reports of destabilization and the fact that now this new pro-European government in Moldova has just been approved by the Moldovan parliament? Is that something that is kind of reassuring to you? And what help is France giving at the moment to Moldova?
So I can tell you, of course, there has been destabilization attempts. You look at what's happening with energy from Russia, misinformation. But the Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, who I met a couple of weeks ago, her priority is to fight corruption. Her priority is to be closer to the EU. And it's because of those priorities and because of those suspicions she had that she has reshuffled the government. So we are helping us in this fight and in getting closer to the EU family with support on energy, because that's what she needs. It's very concrete. We support technical expertise, and she was discussing with me one of the experts we have been providing to help her with the anti-corruption fight. And I think we're providing huge support by putting spotlight on Moldova through the Moldovan platform. And, it gathered here in Paris on the 21st of November last year. And to the forthcoming European Political Community Summit in June.
Let's talk about the European economy and the conclusions of the last EU summit and the response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. But before I ask you a question about that, Laurence Boone, let's listen to Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne, the French Prime Minister, speaking in Brussels this week on this very issue.
While we are, of course, delighted with the ambition displayed by the United States in terms of climate, this legislation may also have negative industrial consequences for Europe. I'd add that Europe must be able to be firm in its interests and promote its values on the international stage.
Laurence, what do you understand by Europe standing up for its interests?
I think the first thing is Europe is realizing, is acknowledging that it is a power. It has 450 million inhabitants who are among the richest on the planet, and it's got a strong power, and it's got a financial and regulatory power. On the financial side, what has been decided at the European Council, on which the Prime Minister and the President of the Commission discussed, is 400 billion euros immediately available in forms of state aid or tax credit or using the cohesion fund. 400 billion, that is matching the US IRA.
Does that mean a subsidy war, effectively, with the US?
It doesn't, because one of the things we do in Europe is to respect the rules-based governance. So the condition we bring with this is to preserve competition within the EU, but to make sure that it's fair. So, Bruno Le Maire was in the United States a couple of weeks ago.
French Minister, yeah.
Yeah. And what he discussed with the US was total transparency on what they would do with the Inflation Reduction Act when a company would like to settle in the US. And this transparency will be communicated to us, and we will be able to offer exactly the same thing in Europe.
On the question of fairness, though, the EU Council conclusions left a few things hanging in the air when it comes to this idea of a sovereignty fund. The Council simply took note of the intention to create such a sovereignty fund. So that doesn't sound like very strong support for the smaller countries.
No, so I can't let you say something like that. First thing is this 400 billion are both state aid and flexibility in the recovery fund that all the small, as you say, countries have, as well as cohesion fund. This is the balance that was achieved between the large and smaller country. That's one thing. Second thing, the sovereignty fund. If you remember, it was announced in September by the President of the Commission, and she repeated that it will be discussed in June, and with the review of the multi-annual the EU budget, basically. Yeah. The last thing on which I think it's worth insisting is commercial. We're becoming commercially assertive. So we have tools to detect excessive subsidies for companies funded by third country that would try and come to the EU soil and sell these goods in a completely unfair competition.
You're talking about China now?
I'm talking about China, among others. And with these new tools that we have and which we will use, they won't be able to do that. So the electric vehicles, for example, if they're overly subsidized, they will have to pay some taxes, and we will restore the level playing field. I think the end of a certain naivety of Europe regarding fair competition in a global world, that's over.
Let's talk about EU-British relations and Franco-British relations as well. There are now reports coming of a possible deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol. What, if anything, can you tell us about that?
What I can tell you is effectively the relationship between the UK and the EU, and France for that matter, have been improving since the fall, which is good because it's, I think, in the interest of everyone that to have a good relationship with your neighbor, especially in times where war is on the continent. Now, one thing which has not changed is that the EU, the European Commission, is leading the discussion with the UK, and then we'll be sharing with the EU countries. We have been united, we European countries, EU countries, since 2016, when the UK decided to leave the European Union. We remain fully united. And the Commission is negotiating on our behalf.
And what about on the migrant issue? Do you see any concrete changes on the ground? Because obviously the bad political relations between France and the UK was sort of the backdrop to a very tense situation along the English Channel, as we say in English. But are you seeing any signs of a shift there as well?
So there are two things. There is the bilateral relationship between France and the UK on this, but there is also a European aspect to this, because obviously the sea is going along, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So we will leave the EU aspect on the side. Again, it's the European Commission negotiating on our behalf. And as far as our two countries are concerned, yes, our Home Affairs Minister are having very productive discussions.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for being my guest, Laurence Boone, the French Secretary of State for European Affairs. And do stay with us. We'll be back after a short break with a panel of MEPs discussing how far European support to Ukraine should go.